The topic today is the history of Savannah Portage area and Ojibwe stewardship past and present. We have Stephen Shaitberger, Episcopal priest and author, and Don Wedll, Mille Lacs historian. Stephen Schaitberger and Don Wedll will provide an historic view of the Savannah Portage and an acknowledgement of the Ojibwe stewardship of the area, past and present. Shaitberger is the author of Stands Before His People, an historic biographer of Enmegahbowh, and he'll say it more correctly. The first Episcopal priest of Ojibwe heritage. His mentor was Father George Smith, the grandson of Enmegahbowh, who immersed him in Ojibwe culture in his youth. He also spent his summers at his family cabin on Lake Minnewawa in the Tamarack area. Don Wedll has an extensive experience working for tribal governments in Minnesota and Alaska. He worked for 34 years for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe in environment, law enforcement, natural resources, and education. His academic background in mathematics, federal Indian law, and environment has provided a unique skill which he applied while a member of the U.S. EPA Committee on Science and Technology and EPA Senior Environmental Enforcement Team. Wedll presently serves on Gwetamong Treaty Rights Museum and Cultural Center and Crow Wing County Historical Society. Stephen and Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have not much to add other than Don and I worked together on a group called Friends of Old Crow Wing, and that's how we've met and developed a friendship and our interest in history. And we've also been working on the Sylvan Dam project, trying to understand the upgraded principles. We'd like to preserve the site of Old Crow Wing, where the agency was that served this area. So our interest is practical as well as historical, and this is an opportunity to talk about the Tamarack. So I think everything you mentioned, I just have been privileged to live on Lake Minnewawa in my elementary years, and then to be taken on as a project by Enmegahbowh's grandson. And I don't know what he saw in me, but I became his acolyte, lay reader, and eventually a priest because of him. And there were many other reasons too, but every summer was spent at Cass Lake on the reservation, and he taught me much of the language and took me to wakes, and I'm just surprised 55 years as a priest, here I am, and I was able to bury George Smith, my mentor, 10 years ago at White Earth. So with that, Don, anything to add?
No, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending, and hopefully we can provide you some good, useful information.
Great. Let's move on. I'll talk about the spirituality of the land from both my understanding. You know, Turtle Island, I think we have words that describe people that really shouldn't be in our language. I think heathen, savage, and they don't belong. I mean, you don't win friends and influence people by calling them pagan, heathen, or savage. I mean, and I'm happy that the Episcopal Church was able to overcome some of this craziness and look at people as people. And the Ojibwe people, when Columbus came to the United States, the Ojibwe people knew the world was round, the earth was round. How they got there, maybe they intuited it, they probably corresponded with people from Central and South America who already had discovered that the Earth was round. So, and the sacredness of the land, the ability to hunt, fish, and gather is so important, and it provides life for everybody. And the fact that when it came time to cede land to the United States, and the Ojibwe chose Mille Lacs, Sandy Lake, Rabbit Lake north of Crosby. They chose these special areas to raise their families and to extend their culture. And that alone should say that this is unceded land. They kept the ability to hunt, fish, and gather on the ceded land as well. But this land was so precious that they risked their future on this land. And to me, to talk about jeopardizing those three sacred spots for the Mille Lacs Band are unconscionable. So I also think we've attitudes towards people. We call the river that comes out of Mille Lacs the Rum River. The Dakota people called it the Wakan River, and Wakan Tonka is the Great Spirit. I mean, how did Spirit River, a sacred river, become the Rum River? Or in Brainerd, in the Arboretum, Whiskey Creek was called by the Ojibwe Manitou Creek. Gitche Manitou is Great Spirit. What are the factors, do you think, that went into naming those rivers and creeks, renaming them, and kind of missing out on their spirituality? Even the French called the St. Louis River and the St. Peter River and the St. Croix River. St. Peter was the initial name for the Minnesota River. They chose spiritual ways to talk about the water, and that's how important it was to both societies. A little bit about the tamarack, the tree itself, for medicine and healing. The area, of course, provides fish. It also provides the wild rice, and of course the animals that are there. And this area, prehistorically, the glacier stopped here, and it's just amazing. Even the rocks are round. They've been polished by the Great Glacier, and they're used to weigh the nets that caught the fish, so the nets weren't tangled. There's just some amazing things about the geography and the way the area has preserved. And I kind of have a grievance with God. Why would you put nickel in this sacred spot? And it just kind of pisses me off. But there we are, and maybe it's to challenge us. Can we do the right thing? And I'm kind of at fault myself. I drive a hybrid, and it has a nickel cadmium battery. I thought at the time I was doing the right thing. And I'm hopeful that I think they do have new batteries to put in, but I love my car. I thought I was doing something good for the environment, and lo and behold, unintended consequences have arisen. With that, I grew up in my military, and my uncle my cousin still owns a house on Lake Minnewawa. I love the Ojibwe word. And just say the word Minnewawa, and how does it make you feel? I guess it's a rhetorical question, but it makes me kind of laugh and be happy. And it's one of those words that sounds like what it means. So I mean, we can translate it happy water or babbling brook. It's those kinds of things that it lends itself to. Well, think about happiness and water and its sacredness. And Don can correct or add anything. And these are the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace that is present in this area.
Yes, I think that, one of the things that many people who are involved in these types of issues have little information about how these things all occurred and how did tribal people remain in this area? What was the relationships? People think about the word treaties and what that might mean to this area, and then there's this deep-seated fear that somehow the tribal people will attack you at night and steal your children, and all these kinds of stereotypes, things that relate to a long history of kind of fragmenting and trying to justify the behaviors of the United States. I do a lot of reading about the historical information, and there was a real struggle in the United States about how to deal with tribal people, and there were groups of people like Schoolcraft and others who said we have to be honest and forthright, and we have to live by the promises we make, and all those kinds of things. And then there were others who, like Andrew Jackson, who felt that, no, this is just something we have the right to take because we're powerful and we can do it. And so we're in that struggle today, as I see it, with the Talon Mine, kind of the same type of thing. We have people who are interested in protecting the land and making sure that it's there and usable for the future. And then we have a group of people who want to tear it up and make money fast on it and then take off and leave it, which has been the history of mining everywhere, is they pull the resources out, and as they diminish the resources, they leave and let the people that are remaining to clean up and deal with the messes that are there. So in this area of Sandy Lake, Minnewawa, the city of Tamarack, it's the geography of it is such that it's very flat. It's a very flat area. So this mining that they're proposing will have just some really significant effects on water and the water levels, and that there needs to be a tremendous amount of work to deal with the hydrology of what they're proposing to do, and they cannot be allowed to be the sole sayer of what the hydrology is going to be dealt with, because they don't have the results will be that their hired people will say there's no problem. And by the time we figure out there is a problem, it's going to be too late. And that's really the story of all of these types of environmental issues, is that these effects occur long after when the project that's being designed or implemented. And as a result, we're stuck with the ramifications of them. One of the particular ones that we're faced right now today is climate change and the releasing of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Stephen was saying that the issue about how come these minerals like nickel and copper are intertwined with this hazardous material like sulfur that'll get released once the mining is done. And I think that there's a old Ojibwe story about how the dinosaurs were destroying everything on the land because they were so big and so aggressive, and they were killing the people and the animals and everything. And there's a legendary trickster in the Ojibwe called Enmegahbowh, and his father was the west wind and his mother was a human. And the animals asked Enmegahbowh to destroy the dinosaurs, and as a result, Enmegahbowh went there and tried to kill them, and he couldn't. And they chased them all over, and finally he asked the animals, he said, I need to find out what the secret of how to kill the dinosaurs. And the kingfisher said, I know the secret. The secret is that you have to shoot their shadow instead of the animal, the dinosaur itself. So Enmegahbowh went out with his bow and shot the shadows of the dinosaur, and they all died. But they laid in the sand where they were sleeping when he shot their shadows. And when the sun beat on them, all the fat from all the eating that they had done drained out of them and went into the lowlands and under the water. And it was stored there. And when the animals went down to drink, they got stuck in there, and Enmegahbowh had to go pull them out. And for example, the bear got stuck, and he was in this water and fat, and when Enmegahbowh pulled him out, he could only get him halfway out. So half of the time the bear is fat and half of the time the bear is thin. And anyway, the rest of the fat was locked into the earth, and it was kind of like the Greek mythology Pandora's box. Mm-hmm. It's there, don't open it. And we've opened up the oil, and we're going to open up the sulfur around the nickel and copper, and that's all things that were supposed to be sealed up and protected, and we weren't supposed to dig those out. And that's kind of an old Ojibwe story about that.
Thank you. Let's talk about, though, the geography of this. And you know that there's a divide between the flowage of the St. Croix River, or excuse me, the St. Louis River that flows to the Atlantic eventually, and the Mississippi that flows to the Gulf. Two major flowages, and at Savannah Portage, they're only separated by 6 feet of elevation. I mean, that is just an amazing geography. And it speaks also to the holiness and the sacredness of this site and its fragility. And if some of the projections, if you would lower the water 6 feet or 4 feet, I mean, you're getting now, and that's only what happens at the surface. What's going to happen underneath? Sooner or later, those aquifers join together underneath, and so you have 2 major watersheds that are at risk in this particular area, and separated by 6 feet of elevation, and the history of this area. Some historians think that Chicago wouldn't have existed without the Savannah Portage and the fur trade that provided some of the commerce and the capital that funded Chicago's growth, and the timber and things that moved through this Savannah Portage. It's been a portage, and it's a very good because most of the Ojibwe people are east of Savannah Portage, and for intermarriage and for family relations, you had to have migration and immigration and visitation that happens through Savannah Portage to solidify your civilization. So it's just so important for the voyagers, for the Ojibwe, and for humanity in general, that this precious little spot on Earth, there's very few like it. And the Ojibwe were smart enough to say, this land we are not going to cede. This one is going to be our future. And for me, anything we can do to assist them in their vision is worthy of doing. And so if you needed more motivation to do what you're doing, that's the motivation I pass on as a historian. I think we can go, and anything you want to comment on that, Don?
I think that people need to understand that for the Ojibwe, the hunting, fishing, and gathering was similar to breathing and drinking. Breathing the air and drinking the water. Those were all things necessary for life. And so that's why it was such an extremely important thing. The other thing is that there is 2 reservations in this general area. One is the Sandy Lake Reservation, and the other one is the Rice Lake Reservation, which is near the Rice Lake wildlife management area there, just to the west of Tamarack.
Good. That reminds me of a story I was told by George Smith, and that is who got swindled for buying Manhattan Island. And he said, maybe the Indians have a different perspective. He said, what if somebody came to you and asked you to buy a bucket of air? How much would you ask if someone said, I'd like to buy a bucket of air? Well, in the concept, you don't sell land. It's there. I mean, it's not something to be bartered with. It's something to live and breathe and to use for growth and food, and it's provided by the Creator for everyone. And so to get what the Indian got for it was thought to be, well, maybe I took advantage of this white person who doesn't know any better. Now they soon learn the difference between land that gets built upon and never used again, covered with asphalt and God knows what. But the sacredness of soil and water was lost, and hopefully we can regain it. Let's go to the next slide. How important are treaties? Let me talk about the War of 1812. And again, some of this comes from story. The Ojibwe were on both sides of the War of 1812. And so the apocryphal story goes something like this. Canadians approached the Ojibwe and said, will you work with us in the War of 1812? Would you side with us? And some of them said, yes, we will. How do you want to do it? He said, well, we're going to stand in a straight line in an open field, and we're going to get about 60 yards apart, and then we'll shoot at each other. And the Ojibwe said, we don't want any part of that. We'll hide in the bushes alongside a road, and if the enemy comes by, we'll shoot them until they recover, and then we'll run like heck and hide. And when the Americans approached the Ojibwe in the United States, they said, will you fight on our side? And they said, sure, how would you like us to fight? So we're going to stand in an open field, and we're going to be 60 yards apart, and we're going to shoot at each other. And they said, no, we aren't going to play that way. We're going to stay on the side of the bush, and when the British go by, we'll shoot them until they recover, and then we'll run like heck and hide. And then the Ojibwe got together and they said, whenever there's any Ojibwe walking by, we'll be quiet as long as you don't tell them where we're hiding. And so they played both sides against the middle. Now, is it recorded in history? No. Is it in oral history? Yes. And so if you value oral history, there's medals that have been given to both sides in gratitude for their participation in the wars. But this is an apocryphal story told to me by George Smith and others about how the Ojibwe, and then the War of 1812 actually ended while it was being fought, and should have ended a year ahead of time. And one of the things that the Ojibwe discovered is that the treaty was used to stop the war. And maybe this was a way to use treaties to preserve their heritage and their culture without fighting a war. And I think there's probably more to it. Ojibwe have been very shrewd in their dealings with each other and with other tribes. And I think they've known about treaties. But to see the West respond to treaties like they did in the war that ended the War of 1812 motivated them to negotiate these treaties and preserve their society and their heritage. And even though they ceded the land, they always excluded the right to hunt, fish, and gather on those lands. And they've rarely exercised that right, but it's still there, and it's a sacred right. And I guess that's my introduction. But I think Don has a better perspective, maybe a more historic one.
Yeah, one of the things, if you look at the map there, you see these blocks that have dates on them. And if you look kind of in the southern or the lower part of the map, you'll see 1837. And that was a land cession of about 12 million acres to the United States. And there was a discussion with the Ojibwe about this land cession and what it meant. But clearly in Article 5, the Ojibwe preserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice on the lands that were hereby ceded during the pleasure of the president. That took about 19 years to get ultimately the Supreme Court to decide that right still existed for the Ojibwe, and they ruled in March of 1999 about that. That line, it's a little difficult to see, but you can see that it's a little bit south of Sandy Lake. And the next land cession above that there are two of them. One is the 1854 land cession. That's the Arrowhead region, and that had a reserved hunting and fishing right on it. And then the 1855 land cession, which is kind of a triangular piece from Moorhead to International Falls down to the 1837 line and then back to Moorhead. That was ceded. But also at that time, the United States government had a policy that it didn't remove tribal people anymore, but it established reservations for them. And these reservations were to be the permanent homeland for the area for them. And so that's when the Chippewa, the Mississippi, as they were referred to, identified 6 areas for reservations. One, the area was at Mille Lacs Lake on the south end of Mille Lacs Lake, which became the Mille Lacs Reservation. The next was Sandy Lake Reservation, which is up along and includes all of Sandy Lake. Then there's the Gull Lake Reservation, which is over by Brainerd-Baxter area and is part of the Gull Lake area, and that's a reservation. Then there's the Rabbit Reservation, which has been talked about a little bit by the area near Crosby. And then there's the Pokegama Reservation, which is up by Grand Rapids. And finally, there's the Rice Lake Reservation, which is on the Rice Lake area just south of McGregor. So those were the 6 reservations of the Chippewa, the Mississippi, that were established when they ceded that large piece of land called 1855 land cession. And the exchange was that the United States would get this land, could utilize the resources on it, and the Ojibwe would have these reservations that would be their permanent home. Part of the problem occurred in 1862 when the Dakota were in the position that they weren't being paid for their land cession, and it's actually their land cession would be the area south of the Ojibwe land cessions, and this was all ceded in 1851. And their cessions, the United States, because of the Civil War, wasn't making payments, and people were having a hard time, and the government wasn't responding as they said they would. And so the Dakota Uprising occurred in Minnesota, or the Dakota conflict. Hole in the Day, who was a leader at Gull Lake, had anticipated joining the Dakota and ended up confronting the United States about their treatment of land and wanting to take the land back from the United States. And as a result, in 1863, the United States government required the cession of these reservations of the Chippewa, the Mississippi, because of the acts of aggression of Hole in the Day. Now, Sandy Lake and Mille Lacs Lake didn't participate in Hole in the Day's effort, in fact, tried to prevent it and did. And as a result, they were exempted from the land cession. And so if you look at the treaties of 1863 and 64, you see that Mille Lacs Reservation was exempted and the Sandy Lake Reservation was exempted from being removed. And the other reservations all were forced to remove, and that's when they were removed to White Earth in 1868 was when that was started. So these are kind of complicated historical relationships that existed at the time, but as you can see, the United States acquired access to all these various tracts of land through treaty sessions, or in fact, if you look at the 1889 by Lake of the Woods, that was actually a cession that was done through federal law rather than through a treaty. The United States government stopped making treaties with Indian tribes in 1871, and that was because there was conflicts with the House and the Senate. Treaties require the Senate to participate in a vote to approve and ratify a treaty, and the House of Representatives does not get to participate, but has to appropriate the money. And the House of Representatives wouldn't appropriate the money because they were mad at the Senate, which then made the treaties difficult to implement because they couldn't get the resources that were promised in the purchase of those. So the one of the things the United States government tried to do was to develop a system where the federal law would be enacted after 1871, and there were no treaties enacted with Indian tribes after that. The other thing that was that, for the most part, most of the land was already acquired by the United States through treaties in 1871. I know that's kind of a long history, but there are still tribal governments at Mille Lacs, at Sandy Lake, and at Rice Lake.
My involvement was the fact that Enmegahbowh was fluent in both English and Anishinaabe, and was able to meet 9 presidents because the Ojibwe of these bands took him to Washington to help them understand the obligations and communicate. And he was trusted, and he was taken to Washington by the Sandy Lake Band and the Rabbit Lake Band to try to get their land back, because they did not participate in the uprising by Hole in a Day in 1862. And in fact, Bad Boy from Mille Lacs was instrumental in warning settlers. And many of the settlers in the Crosby area went to the reservation at Sandy Lake and were protected, and Hole in a Day refused, or thought better of going into Sandy Lake's village to seek out white people. So they, in effect, protected the white people. And I'm just been very surprised. I'm doing a presentation with Don in July at the good relations that were taking place between the Ojibwe and the white people at Rabbit Lake. Unbelievable. And to have them be forcibly removed to White Earth is most tragic. And like I say, I wish I would have known about that before I wrote my book, because that would have deserved a whole chapter. But it shows you how the two societies could live together. All right. Anything else on this one, Don?
No.
Let's go to the next slide. Lowering the water level 6 feet by mining the area would drain most of Lake Minnewawa. I think that's true. I grew up fishing right off of the point, and then to the Lake Minnewawa had a floating bog when I was young, and the bog went all over Lake Minnewawa, depending on the direction of the wind and the power of the wind. And when I went back there a few years ago, they have now secured the floating bog to the side of the lake, so it's now a secure part of the shoreline. But it was amazing to fish around the floating bog. But the wild rice, often I'd be fishing, and the Native Americans would be ricing in their canoes, and to hear the click click of the wood as they brush the seed off, and then to watch the ducks next to them as if they're all friendly. The ducks were eating the rice that was actually reseeding the rice bed as they were harvesting it. It's just and the question is, are the treaties being violated? And if you have the right to hunt, fish, and gather, and and you can no longer hunt, fish, or gather because there's no water, have you violated the treaty? I think anybody with a common sense would say, yes, that treaty is being violated. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but it's very frustrating. And how do you object to such a thing without somebody saying, well, maybe these treaties should be taken away completely? So you're in a tough spot, and maybe Don can best speak to that, how the tribe is being opposed, but being carefully opposed.
Right. There's a lot of technical issues that get involved once you start utilizing or trying to utilize treaty rights and tribal government rights that become very complicated, and rulings that affect them, are things that go all the way to the Supreme Court. And Mille Lacs took a case to the Supreme Court, as I said earlier, back in the Supreme Court ruled in March of 1999 about hunting, fishing, and gathering. And so that set precedents about the rights to hunt, fish, and gather, but the details of how much impact can the state impact their rights before it becomes actionable is another whole question that's not very clear in the law. So that's something that's still out there. It probably will have some impacts in regard to what they're trying to do with the mining issue here. There's certain cases where tribal rights have superseded the desire to make a mine and to mine minerals, and as a result, the mining didn't occur. And so these are the types of things that I think need to be explored and worked on by the tribal governments in relationship to the impacts that this mine will have.
What's the signage? Remind me what it is as you come on the reservation.
Water over nickel.
Yes, water over nickel.
And
that answers Cindy's question here. What kind of mining is this? Nickel mining.
Right. And it's the video about the water over nickel won some awards for its development and its protection on trying to protect the waters in this resource in this area. But it's a huge issue.
I have heard that the settler and Ojibwe relations were strong given the trade relationships that had been established. It appears that the first couple of generations were very good, and then it went into the dumper, and it's very frustrating. I don't understand what happened. It's up to other historians, I think. Maybe Don has an insight into it.
Well, a lot of what I saw, I worked at Mille Lacs for some 30 years. What I saw was that a lot of times people moved into the area, bought land or bought cabins and that type of thing. And they had no connection. They didn't have any understanding that there were tribal people in the area. And as a result, they developed all these fears that were unfounded or stereotypes, that they had. And they talked to their neighbors and they started both having these, oh, this is awful and this might affect us and we need to do something about it. And what are these rights and all this, where historically people who lived in the area, settlers that moved in, had a good relationship. Not all. There were people who were constantly trying to take advantage of the tribe and getting, trying to take over lands and tribal lands for their own purposes and that type of thing. But for the most part, there was a good relationship between the non-tribal and the tribal people.
I had a question. Where can they buy my book? You can't get it on Amazon. Amazon wants 55% of the profit. And so I receive not a dime from my book sale, and it's all the profits go to Indian congregations. We have 4 on White Earth, 3 on Leech Lake, 2 on Red Lake, and I've included the Dakota congregations as well because Enmegahbowh established a treaty with the Dakota people at Fort Abercrombie in 1869, and the Sisseton Wahpeton tribe,
right,
in particular.
It was called the Sweet Corn Treaty.
There you go. And Enmegahbowh wasn't at that treaty, but he inspired the leadership that went to that treaty. He was getting old in those days. He died at 92, we guess, because he didn't know for sure when he was born.
Uh-huh.
And I don't, all the proceeds, like I say, go through to the Diocese of Minnesota for Indian congregations and the 2 congregations of the Dakota people at Prairie Island and Lower Sioux. So, it's my way of doing something rather than nothing for the injustice my friends have had to endure, and I can't see us. I think Canada's making great strides in trying to do reconciliation and some kind of monetary response or some kind of justice. But that's another story. We seem to be lagging far behind. I think we've allowed greed to be way too much in our society. Any other questions that people have? Well, thank you very much for listening, and I'm always available. I've given you my email if that's. Did everybody get it there?
Yes, that's very helpful, Stephen.
Okay.
Hopefully, we can continue to deepen our knowledge. And thank you, Don, for that incredible mythological story about the Ojibwe and the dinosaurs. That was absolutely delightful. And now I know why my spirituality centers on Savannah Portage State Park.
There you go.
And when I'm sad or pissed off, as Stephen said earlier, I'm going to just say the word Minnewawa.
There you go.